Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to look at how to compile SCSS and SASS files using Hugo. We're also going to be running postcss and the Autoprefixer plugin. We're going to be using Bootstrap 5 as a SCSS source, and we'll be using Autoprefixer to create vendor prefixes for Bootstrap 5. So for today's video, having hugo-extended set up and Visual Studio Code set up is assumed knowledge. I've got a link above to a video to help you install hugo-extended. You'll have already run npm init and you'll have a package.json file present in your project. And there's another link above for my previous video, which is setting up Hugo with npm. The outcomes from today's video, you'll be able to install required npm packages to run Hugo with Autoprefixer. You'll be able to set up libsass via Hugo config, and you'll be able to set up postcss and Autoprefixer via postcss.config.js. You'll be able to configure Bootstrap 5 SCSS imports. You'll be able to compile Bootstrap 5 SCSS to CSS, and we're going to be fingerprinting the CSS file for cache busting and possible security improvements. We're also going to be creating custom variables to alter the Bootstrap 5 CSS output, so you don't have to override the CSS and create extra lines of code. You'll need the latest Hugo extended version to compile CSS, SCSS and SASS. The standard Hugo version doesn't support SCSS and SASS compilation. Hugo uses libsass to compile SCSS and SASS code. Libsass isn't the current preferred compiler. It's actually been depreciated, but it still does the job, especially for Bootstrap 5. It's not a problem. It will eventually be upgraded to Dart.sass, but currently it's quite complicated to install Dart.sass into Hugo. We'll be including some code to make sure that no breaking changes happen when libsass is upgraded to Dart.sass, because the configurations aren't compatible with each other. I'll be releasing a new video in the future when Hugo upgrades to Dart.sass, but for now libsass works perfectly fine, with the exception of cutting edge features which we don't need for Bootstrap 5 and aren't commonly used anyway. For part 1, installing packages, we're going to be using npm to install postcss, postcss-cli, which stands for command line interface, Autoprefixer, and the Bootstrap 5 package. Inside Bootstrap 5 there's JavaScript and SCSS. In this video we're just talking about importing the SCSS components of the Bootstrap 5 package. We're going to use this command. You can copy and paste it from the description below. Sometimes you'll see npm install shortened to npmi, but I'm going to use npm install because it's easy to read and especially makes more sense for beginners. So I've put a link in the description below for a template so you can get started with this tutorial. If you've already got a Hugo project, you have to make sure that you have previously run npm init inside that project, and that will create a package.json file. If you've already got a package.json file, or you've downloaded the Git repository template for this tutorial and you're ready to get started, now you can copy and paste the command from below to install the required packages. And then hit enter, and it will npm will automatically install those packages for you. Alright, so the package is installed. Now the SASS workflow, we're going to be importing the required SCSS files from Bootstrap's npm package. We're going to add custom variables to customize the CSS output. And that means you're not creating extra lines of code, we're actually modifying Bootstrap itself. We're going to add custom CSS code at the end of the file. We're going to then compile that SASS code to CSS, and it's going to be output as one CSS file. And for production use, for the final website that you're going to upload to a server or Netlify, we're going to be running the file through Autoprefixer, so we can add required vendor prefixes for older browsers. This will happen automatically based on the browsers list RC file. And we're going to use Bootstrap's browsers list RC to support all of the browsers that Bootstrap supports. but you can modify that if you want to. We're also going to minify the file or compress it to reduce its size. The next thing we have to do is create a list of browsers that Autoprefixer will use when it's determining which browser vendor prefixes need to be created. Now the easiest way to do that is to go onto the Bootstrap GitHub repository. I'll leave a link below. And then the problem here is they've released version 4 in parallel with version 5 in the same repository. So you have to go to releases, scroll down, look for the newest version 5, go to the hash, and then browse files. You'll now be looking at the version 5 files, and that matches the version that we've just installed with npm. Now, inside the .browsers list rc file, there'll be a list of browsers. Now, the easiest way is just to copy those contents of that file, go back into your project, and then create a new file in the base called .browsers list rc. And then paste the contents in there and save it. Now that we've done that, we'll set up a partial which will run the compiler. So go into your layouts folder and partials and create a new file called libsass.html. Now the reason I'm calling it libsass is that's the name of the compiler. In the future, if libsass is upgraded to .sass, we won't have breaking changes due to the config we're about to write. Now, we'll start it off with our link tag. So link, and then we need rel equals style sheet. We need a href. I'm going to leave that blank for now. We're going to use an integrity parameter. Going to leave that one blank. And cross origin anonymous. Alright, so what we're going to do now is write the code that will compile. It will take an input, it will compile CSS from SCSS or SASS, and we're going to insert that compiled file into the href. We'll also generate a hash for integrity. So we'll start with the source. So we do open brackets. Now, if we write it like this, what will happen is you'll end up with a space in the new line at the end of it. We don't want that because it's a template. So we're going to put a dash at the start and the end. You have to make sure there's a space between the dash and your actual code. And what will happen now is there'll be no space or new line inserted into your project because of this template. So we're defining a variable here, the src variable with the $sign. When you define the variable, you have to make sure you use a colon next to the equals, and if you reassign it, you just use the equals. We'll use that in a moment. So we're going to go down a few lines, and we're going to reassign source. So source equals source. And we're going to use a pipe, and this is a chain of command. So the next thing we're going to do, so we're using resources.get. That's going to get pulled into here. Then we've got our pipe, and then we're going to use toCSS. And let's use capitals for CSS. And then we're going to run our CSS options or CSS config. So CSS options. And then we're going to run through postCSS. And then we will run our post options. And then after that, we are going to fingerprint. All right. So on its own, that will work, but we're going to create some configuration options. So we'll start off with our postCSS options. Because it's the first time, we have to make sure we put a colon in next to our equals. We need to provide a dictionary. or dict. That's basically creating a map. And our config file location is going to be inside the config directory, which we're about to create, /postcss.config.js. I'll actually leave a space before that final dash. All right, let's now define the options for toCSS. So we're going to do CSS ops equals, and now again we've got to do a dictionary or a dict, again, which is a map. And the first option that we're going to be putting in here, we're going to be first writing the options for production. So transpiler is libsass. Output style will be compressed. Make sure capital S on style. Compressed. By default it isn't. So I need to make sure I configure that. And we're going to use another option here called include paths. Now when we create the configuration for include paths, we have to do it as a slice. Inside that slice, slice is like an array, we provide strings. And what we're worried about is node modules. So we want the node modules path to be included into libsass. So we don't have to actually write node modules when we're importing from the node modules folder. We can forget about that because libsass will automatically look there. Now, if you wanted to put a second item in there, you just leave a space, put in some commas, and put your folder name in. But we're not going to do that. I'm then going to include a space and a dash so we don't end up with any extra spaces. So we've got enough configuration there to get started. I'm going to save that. The next thing we're going to do is configure postcss. So we're going to make a config folder. Currently our configuration sits down here. We're going to make a folder for it called config. Inside that you need a folder which is _ default, and that's where your config.yaml lives. And in a future video I'll show you how you can create different folders for different environments. For now we'll just stick with the default. And then inside your config folder we'll make a new file called postcss.config.js. Now inside this folder we're going to configure postcss to run Autoprefixers. The first thing you have to do is create a variable, or a constant in this case, for Autoprefixer so that postcss knows where to find the plugin. So const Autoprefixer equals, we're going to require this require Autoprefixer is going to straight away relate to our node modules folder. So postcss will know to look in the node modules folder. Just like we configured libsass to look in the node modules folder, postcss will be looking in the node modules folder and it will find Autoprefixer, which we've already installed. Now we get to do our config. So we're going to do module.exports. Do a curly brace. Plugins. Do a square bracket. And now to start with, we're just going to run Autoprefixer all the time, and then we'll come back and we'll configure it so that it only runs during production. So for now, we're just going to run Autoprefixer. When you write Autoprefixer, we're picking up this constant up here. Some people put the require straight in their code, but it's much easier if you define them at the top. Make sure you do open and close brackets. And you don't put a colon at the end. If you're doing multiple plugins, you'd put a comma and put your next plugin, but if it's just one plugin, we don't need the comma. So we'll save that. So we've got our partial here. The next thing we have to do is we have to call that partial in the header of our project. As you can see here, we're pulling down the context from where we call the partial, and that's going to be our source. So let's go into the head of our project, we'll see we've got Bootstrap here coming in from the CDN. We'll comment that out with Control-KC. We'll leave it there just for later in case we need to use it for testing purposes. We then open our bracket and we're going to run a partial, and it's libsass. Now you don't need .html. Hugo already looks for that for you. And normally you'd put a full stop in for the context, but we don't need to access the full context from within the partial. All we need is the source. So we're going to create that file next, and that file will be, it's inside the assets folder, libsass, because it's resources.get looks inside the assets folder. So we don't have to put the assets folder in here, but we are going to be looking inside the SCS folder /index.scss. That's the file we're about to create. So we'll save that. We'll then create our assets folder. This is where you store all of your assets for Hugo to process. And we'll have an SCSS folder inside there, and then an index.scss. So now Hugo's set up to, we're going to run the libsass partial. We're telling it to open up our index.scss, and then inside the partial, we're running resources.get on that file. And then from there, from resources.get, we're going to run toCSS, postcss, and fingerprint it. The next thing you've got to do is tell Hugo, we're going to insert the file that we're outputting into the href and also our fingerprint. So we're going to open up the brackets, we'll put a dash in to get rid of any spaces, and it's src.permalink with a capital P. I'm going to use the pipe. I'm going to convert that to a relative URL just to keep things a bit smaller so I don't get a massive big long address. And then in integrity, it's a little bit tricky. We've got to run again our src variable dot data with a capital D dot integrity with a capital I. And that will be a hash, a security hash, and that will change every time the file is updated, and it also lets the browser check that the correct file is being imported and someone hasn't replaced your style sheet. So we'll save that. Next thing we've got to do is update our SCS file. So we're going to go to the Bootstrap website. So I'm on the doc section of the Bootstrap 5 website. If you go down to build tools, the first part is all about downloading the entire Bootstrap repository and building it using their scripts. We don't want to do that. We're just importing the SCS component of it. So if you scroll down, they explain that you have to compile the SAS files. You then have to run them through Autoprefixer. And they've got a link here to the .browserslist.rc file, which we've already used. They then have the option of running RTL CSS. Now that's if you're trying to support a language that runs from right to left. And I'm not going to get into that in this video. And I don't recommend running RTL CSS because you're going to create a lot more CSS and you're going to reverse the direction of your Bootstrap utility classes when it comes to padding left. We normally write padding start and padding end, and that will be padding left or padding right. It will actually reverse those. So you don't run RTL CSS unless you're trying to support those languages. So down in Customize and SAS, we then have instructions on how to proceed. Now the basic option here is to import everything. So we'll just start with that option first. So we're going to copy that, and then we're going to paste that into our index.scss file, and we'll save it. Now you'll notice we're going back one directory, up one directory, and then node modules. Now we can actually get rid of that, and we can have a much simpler path to the file. And that's because we use the include paths in our libsass partial. So we'll save that, and then we'll run Hugo. So if you're using the template, which I've linked below, or you watched the previous video, you'll already have a dev script set up for running the development server. Let's run the development server and let's see if it works. So that's looking great so far. If you control click on the link, so it's looking great. Now if you right click and inspect and go to sources, you'll see we've got the SCSS folder, and inside there we've got our index.scss, and there's the hash, and there's our code in there. Now it's currently being minified, so it's all on one line. Now the next thing that we have to do, you can check, is if you go down onto elements, which is what happens when you first open it up, and go to the head, you'll see the link. There's the file that Hugo's automatically put the path to, and there's also, we have our integrity hash. So everything's looking great. Now in this part, we're going to look at how to only include the parts of Bootstrap which you need for your website. This is going to reduce the file size of your website's CSS. You need to make sure you're importing the correct components for your website. If you do not import a Bootstrap component that you've referenced in your website, that part of the CSS will be missing and your site's display will be broken. If you're going to add new features to your site, you have to make sure that you check your imports to check that you've actually imported that Bootstrap component, otherwise the feature will not work. The Bootstrap feature will not work. So down at option B, and it's a little bit deceiving, we can copy and paste this code, but if you read carefully, they haven't actually included all of the components for us, and that's a little bit annoying because usually you'd want to start with everything and then pair it back. So we'll start by copying that. We'll replace what we've already got, and we're going to go through and we'll take these paths out, the node modules path out, the directory out, just to clean it up. But unfortunately that's not going to be enough to get us started. So on the docs it says down here, we suggest using the full import stack from the bootstrap.scss file as a starting point. And wouldn't that be great if they already had it there for us? But that's all right. You can say this is a template. You can come back to it. Now, where do you find that file? So if you go into node modules and scroll down to Bootstrap, this is the whole Bootstrap package here. Open up SCSS, and then you'll notice all these files have underscores, and that's because they aren't meant to be imported directly. Usually use the import command for these. So go down to Bootstrap and you'll see what we need to import. So we've already imported functions, variables and mix-ins, the first three. You then need to import utilities. So we'll pop that in at the top. There's then root, reboot, type, images, containers and grid. And we will copy and paste the rest of those down to the bottom, and you'll notice we're missing this path because the path used here is relative to where this file sits, and we're not calling the import from inside that folder. So you'll have to go back in and manually paste it in. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you can hold down, or another code editor, you can hold down the Alt key and click to the left of all these files. And you can definitely save what you're doing today as a template and use that for future projects. Or you can copy and paste it if need be. All right, so you paste that in, save it, and I'll just clean up this top one. And it's complaining. Let's have a look what the problem is. So it's saying, up the top, we're missing one slash. So we'll save that. And it's saying line 5. We're missing Bootstrap at the start. It can't find the file. It's really handy if you've got the Hugo development server running because it gives you live feedback. All right, that's looking great. Let's go back into the browser. We'll refresh it and it looks looking good. So we'll go to our sources and you'll see that it's all there. Next thing we'll do, before we prune out part of this, we're just going to go through and we're going to set up libsass partial so that it runs differently with a development server. So go into your layouts folder again, open up your libsass partial. So what we're going to change is the options. So we've currently got our options running. We're going to make a second version of them for development server. Now, the easiest way to do this is if .site with capital .is server. Now, if the development server is running, that will be true. I don't like using that because sometimes I use the development server to test the production environment. So the way I do it, slightly more complicated, we go if EQ, and we're looking at hugo.environment, and that will return a string. And if we're in development, the following will happen. And I'm going to put the end tag in. So we'll copy our configuration from the top line. We'll paste it inside here. I like to indent it in just so it's a bit clearer. So we can get rid of output style compressed because the default is not compressed. We've got our include pass. There's one more thing where we will add but, and that's enabling source maps. So enable source map is the configuration, and we're going to assign true. Now you don't need inverted commas around true because it's a boolean. It's either true or false. They don't require inverted commas around them, just like numbers. Now you notice that there is a semicolon. Now because we're reassigning the options for the CSS ops variable, we have to remove that colon. We can now reassign the variable. If you have that colon in there, it's not going to work. So we'll save that. We'll see that the Hugo's picked that up. You may have to restart the server. Let's have a look. So we'll refresh the page, go into SCSS, and you'll see that we actually don't have to restart the server. It's no longer compressed. That's looking great. Now, currently, Autoprefixer is running all the time. So what we'll do, just to check out how it's looking, we'll open up our SCSS file in a new tab. And then inside there, we'll do Control F, and we'll type in WebKit. And you'll see on the right, this is why I use a new tab, that WebKit appears all the way through. Now the first part is our CSS reset for your browser defaults so that every browser has the same defaults due to Bootstrap. That's already been hand typed with these browser prefixes here that you'll see. So don't worry about those. If you keep scrolling down, you'll see we've got all these browser prefixes that Autoprefixer has put in there for us. Now, that's based on our browsers list file down here. So currently, Autoprefixer is supporting all of the browsers that Bootstrap supports. If you'd like to support more browsers, you've just got to go in here and modify this file. So let's have a go at setting up PostCSS so it only runs the Autoprefixer plugin during production. So what we're going to do, we'll put an exclamation, and then we're going to type process.env. That's env for environment, and we're going to pull in Hugo's environment. So Hugo in capitals _ environment. Now, the exclamation mark at the start is for if not. So if it's not equal to development, make sure you spell that correctly. So if we're not in development, so we put a question mark in, Then we'll run Autoprefixer. And put in a colon, and this is for if we are in development, we'll just return null. So we'll put a little comment in here above it. So these plugins are not run in development. The reason I do this is because there's one development environment, but there are many other environments, and I want to run Autoprefixer in the other environment, but I don't want to run it in development. Some people would put production in here, but there are a few different environments. So let's just leave it like that. We'll save it. You will have to stop the server. I'm going to restart the server. So now we're in the development environment, and you'll see that because it's the default environment for the server. But if you look at the text in the console, you'll see environment development. So you have to refresh the page. Whenever you restart the server, you have to refresh the page. Auto refresh doesn't work when you kill the server. Inspect the file, open up your index. We're going to open that new tab so we can do a Control F and get our feedback on the right. And you'll see I've searched for WebKit, and WebKit is only appearing in the first part of the file. And they're already hand typed into Bootstrap. They're already there. They don't need to be auto prefixed. So that's looking great. So now that we've set that up and we've got our CSS not compressed because we're in the development environment and we've run our code, let's go through and let's prune out some parts of Bootstrap that we're not using. So you've got to be careful. If it's a really complicated site, you've got to go through and check every part of it to make sure it functions properly. If you're adding new parts to your site, obviously you've got to go back and make sure that they're set up. But we go through our imports and it's just a case of commenting them out. Now, if it's a few in a row, you can highlight them. I'm just going through ones that I know I'm not using. And I'll do Control K-C. Alert I normally use for messages at the top of the page. I also use it for messages, JavaScript messages, for example, in a contact form. So I'm going to leave that one. I don't use badge very often, usually for online stores, so I'll comment that out. Pagination, and definitely I don't use that very often, although it is great with Hugo. Breadcrumbs too, I'm not using them in this site, but it does work really well with Hugo. I'll make sure I do a video on that. We're definitely not using accordion. Card I use quite commonly. Nav and navbar, we'll leave that. Button group, I'm not going to use that at the moment. Drop down, I'll use that for the menus. We'll get rid of transition. We'll need buttons, we'll need forms. Tables aren't very common. You'll need grid containers, images, type. You'll definitely need reboot and root and utilities, and the top ones we're not going to touch. We'll refresh and we're still working, but look, there isn't a lot of CSS on this website, so you're not going to see it. Now, if you want to test to see how big the file is, we'll go back to VS Code, and I've got a script built into this template, and if you watched the last video, you'd know all about it. And we're starting the server in production. Now, I've used dev for development server. Down here with start, I'm actually rendering to disk, and that's useful for debugging. But right now, I'm more worried about the fact that I'm starting as in production mode. Now, you'll see in that tooltip that's just popped up, the environment is production. So I'll hit the start button. I'll just kill the old version. So I'll refresh the browser, go into sources, and here's our file. Now, if you go over into the network tab, you'll see a list of all the files that have been downloaded off the server. This is probably the easiest place to check them out. And there's our index.css. And you'll see there it's 112 bytes. And that's because we've stripped out a lot of the parts we're not using. And it's also been minified or compressed for us. You'll see here we've got a Bootstrap bundle.js file. And it's been served out of memory. Let's turn off disable the cache and we'll reload. And we'll see there our Bootstrap bundle's 22.9 kilobytes. I'm going to show you another video how to build JavaScript files using Hugo, and we can also strip out the parts we don't need. So that's looking great. Custom Bootstrap variables. It's much more efficient to create variables and modify the way Bootstrap works than to override Bootstrap with your own CSS. Because if you override Bootstrap's CSS, you're creating extra lines of code. If you use variables, you're just changing Bootstrap itself. You're going to end up with a new, different type of CSS file. It'll be way different to the CSS that you can get from the CDN or you can download from the Bootstrap website. So we're in the index.css file, and at number 2 it says include any default variable overrides here. Now we're still on the SASS page on the Bootstrap docs. If you scroll down just below this code that we've copied, it talks about variable defaults. Now all of the defaults that are provided, and I'll show you where to find this, they've all got the default flag. If we copy and paste the variables and remove that default flag, we can override. So I'm just going to copy and paste this example here, and I'm going to paste it in, and if we save it and go back to our website, we'll see that it's changed the text color and it's changed the background. But I don't like the way they're laid out. So let's go through and let's do some work with colors. So you go into your node modules folder, find the Bootstrap folder inside there, go into SCSS and then look for the variables file. In here you'll find every single variable that you can override. Now the trick is, if you want to reference any of these colors, you have to copy and paste those colors first. So I'm going to copy and paste in all of the grays up the top. And then I'm going to copy and paste in the colors. And then I'm going to copy and paste in the Bootstrap color classes. And these are used for CSS, such as text primary, button primary, and so on. So now I'm going to reference for my body background. A common one is light. So I can just reference the SCSS variable light. And for my text color, I'm going to reference, for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to reference dark. Dark's actually the default, but I'll reference it here anyway. And we can save that and see the results. Now say for example the background wasn't quite dark enough for you, it's still too off-white. What you can do is, we'll see we've referenced light, and up here light is linked up to grey 100, so we can change that. You probably change it to grey 200, but so you can see it and it's obvious, I'm going to change it to grey 300, and you'll see it's darkened a lot, but to make it look a lot nicer, I'm going to put on grey 200. Now say back to grey 100 actually. Now say for example the text, say it wasn't light enough for you, let's change that to grey 700. So dark is now grey 700, and all the dark items on your website have now become a lot lighter, but I think that's a little bit too light, so I'm going to change that to grey 800. Make sure if you're modifying variables, you remove that default flag from the end of them. Now it's going to be a lot cleaner if we copy and paste all of these custom variables and put them into their own file. So I'm going to cut them out of here at import, and I'll reference variables. Make sure you put a semicolon at the end. I'm not going to save that yet because I need to make the file. So I'll paste them in there, save the file, I'll save my index.scss, and Hugo has rebuilt successfully. the last thing you've got to be able to do is custom CSS. So we can add it down here. For example, we'll do .custom text, and then color. Now you could put in a hash value, or you can actually reference from Bootstrap. So for example, we could put in there grey 500. You might even want to call it grey text. You can then go into your website and we'll put in a div class grey text, and then we'll write some grey text. And you'll see it's turning out grey. We can inspect it and it's pulling in the grey text class. Now, just like I did with the variables, it'd be a lot cleaner if you import that. We might call that global, and we can define things for the whole website in there. Keep it simple. Normally I create a bunch of folders here for organizing my code, but for the purpose of this video, we're just keeping it simple. And then we'll save that and we'll go back. So that's it for today's video. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below. And as usual, subscribe to get regular updates and hit that notification bell so you can receive the regular updates. I'll be linking the completed project from today's video in the comments below. Thanks for watching.